Eighth story. Last but not least, a wizard proven right, and a badger finishes his work. Ludwig Mole sat at his new desk, looking through his thick spectacles at the letter he had written so very carefully. He'd reread the lines several times now, just as carefully as he had written them, to make sure he hadn't misspelt anything. The mole was no seasoned writer. Back in the old days he had occasionally written his wife long letters. That was many years ago, but his wife still saw the bold writer of days long gone in him, so she took every opportunity to remind her husband of his talents. She had a soft spot for talented animals. That's why she was also the head of the Mousewood Art Society, organizing exhibitions and readings every second Thursday, featuring paintings and poems by Mousewood's resident artists. If there was an exhibition or reading scheduled, letters had to be sent to all members of the society, and Ludwig had to write those letters. Admittedly, his new desk did make the work actually more convenient. This letter, however, was especially important. Ludwig got up from his chair, took the letter and walked over to the massive wooden door leading from his study to the hallway. If he had employed a secretary, this is where she would have sat, typing on her typewriter. But Ludwig didn't have a secretary. What he did have, however, was a kind neighbour who helped him write the letters. Nicholas the lizard sat in the hallway, his slouch hat in his hands. As Ludwig entered, Nicholas rose, straightening his jacket. "G'day," Nicholas said. "My wife asked you to assist me, didn't she?" Ludwig asked, squinting because the lizard was too slim to be seen properly by a mole. "She certainly did." "Jolly good. Well, here's the text," Ludwig said, offering the sheet of paper to the hat stand, which did have a slight resemblance to Nicholas. The lizard shuffled over to the mole, took the sheet from his hands and looked at it. Then Mrs. Mole came in, happy to find Nicholas and her Ludwig getting along. She liked companionable animals. "Ludwig, have you written the letter?" she asked. She saw the sheet of paper and yanked it out of the lizard's hands, since she was in a hurry. "Splendid, Ludwig," she called out, skimming through the text before giving Nicholas the letter back. Then she pushed both men through the door into the study and said, "Now the two of you copy this text till we have enough letters, one for every resident of Mousewood. Hurry up, and please, in your best handwriting." Then she closed the door. The lizard and the mole started to write the invitations. 2 days later, a postman came by to pick up the letters and take them to the post office. As a tired Nicholas and an overwrought Ludwig handed him the bundle, he could have sworn both of them had been close friends for years and years. In fact, it had only been 2 days. The following Thursday, the beaver, head of the post office beside the stream, was sorting parcels by address and addressee at his huge sorting desk. The water wheel clattered as the rivulet made its babbling way downstream, when suddenly the post office door opened and the wizard entered. As he crossed the old wooden floor, one couldn't be sure if it was the wood or the old man's bones that were creaking. As usual, the wizard had come to bother the beaver with the same question he'd been asking for weeks. The old man cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Master Beaver, but is there any post for me?" he asked politely. The beaver stared at the wizard in disbelief. For an instant he thought it was just the wizard's strange sense of humour. Then he considered the possibility that the wizard himself could have gone a bit strange due to his incredible age. He looked into the wizard's eyes, wondering how old he might be. "Master Beaver?" the wizard said, not sure if he had already asked for his post or not. Not because he was old and forgetful, but because the beaver hadn't responded. "As I've already told you, we deliver post directly to your home, and nothing has been forgotten," the beaver reassured him. And if he'd been taller, he might even have patted the old man on the back to comfort him. "There is definitely post for me," the wizard said with conviction. "Haven't we discussed this already?" asked the beaver. Since it was too complicated to explain why he hadn't actually been mistaken, not even the first time, the wizard didn't waste time explaining. But he didn't give in either. "Listen. All the residents of Mousewood have had post in recent days. Each and every one. Only my letter seems to be missing," said the wizard. "I delivered my own post just yesterday," the beaver said, "but I haven't had time to read it yet. You should maybe check your post box thoroughly. You may find your letter." Slowly but surely the wizard was getting impatient. He had already checked his own post box to such a degree he was worried he had overdone it. So the bearded man opened the wooden case he carried on his shoulder and took out his magic wand. In fact, a real wizard doesn't need a wand to cast spells, but by using his wand he could demonstrate to the beaver there was magic involved. Silence and focus were now essential. The wizard waved his wand. Magic sparks zapped through the air, glistening in iridescent colours. The wizard then murmured magic words in a language long forgotten. Roughly translated, it meant, "Watch out! There is magic about to happen, and you never know with magic, so don't complain or anything." Then he pointed the wand into the room, and a short burst of lightning shot out of the tip and, with a sizzle, hit the cupboard on the wall by the sorting desk. This literally breathed life into the cupboard, and it started to lumber towards the wizard and the beaver on short wooden legs. The wizard seemed even more startled than the beaver. Luckily, the march of the furniture came to a halt a moment later. By the wall, where the massive cupboard had until that moment stood, lay a letter on the floor. It must have fallen off the desk. The beaver picked up the envelope and read the address. To the wizard, Mousewood. The old man opened the envelope and skimmed the contents. "Dear friends and neighbours, the Mousewood Art Society is happy to invite you to a very special occasion. Next Thursday, one of Mousewood's great artists will exhibit his paintings to the public for the first time. These works, created over recent years, depict the forest and its residents in the most diverse situations and circumstances. You may even discover yourself in the paintings of this extraordinary artist, and you will certainly see the forest from a new perspective. We look forward to welcoming you next Thursday at Marigold Meadows. Best wishes, the Mousewood Art Society." The wizard gave the letter back to the beaver. The latter pondered a while, since he wasn't sure if he was allowed to read it. After all, it wasn't addressed to him. Deep down, of course, the beaver knew one shouldn't read foreign post. But since this letter was addressed to all residents of Mousewood, and his own letter waited unread at home, and it was okay with the wizard, he read it anyway. "That's today, isn't it?" said the beaver. "Right now, to be precise," replied the wizard. "Can we make it in time?" asked the beaver. The wizard's eyes flashed. They flashed with the same magic that had moved the cupboard, and was now, with a bit of luck and focus, to get them to Marigold Meadows in time. "We can," the wizard said confidently. The beaver and the wizard left the post office, and after the beaver had locked the door, the wizard lifted him onto his shoulders. Then the old man focused intensely, channeling magic powers. He hadn't done that in quite a while, so he wasn't sure if it would work. But then it happened. The wizard was no longer standing on solid ground, but instead floating a good 5 inches above it. The beaver hung on tight to the wizard's collar as the old man accelerated, going faster and faster until he was racing at high speed along the dusty tracks leading to Mousewood, with the beaver still clinging to his shoulder. It was quite a sight. The wizard stood upright and unmoving, yet gliding fast, raising clouds of dust behind him as his white beard fluttered in the wind. As the wizard and the beaver headed towards Mousewood, they flew over a small animal with a bushy auburn tail and beady black eyes as it popped out of the bushes. It was Edward the squirrel. Edward had gone missing a few days previously during a practice session of popping out from behind something. The squirrel had used the time to think about his life, acorns and nuts. Seeing him, the wizard broke his stride, swaying in mid-air like a buoy in a choppy sea. "Edward, what are you still doing here?" the beaver asked the squirrel from the wizard's shoulder. "Why, hello," Edward said. "Have I missed something?" "We're in a hurry," the wizard said, "and you are invited." As he spoke, the old man tapped the wooden case strapped to his right side with his left hand. Edward needed no further explanation. Swiftly he climbed up the wizard's leg, leapt onto the wooden case, and held tight to the leather straps. The wizard went back a few paces, and then took off over the forest track again at high speed. "I don't think this is going to work," shouted Rushlight. He was en route with his old friend Mr. Brown on a cart borrowed from the Badgers. Rushlight was pedalling the bicycle, propelling the cart as hard as he could, but it wasn't moving. "We're running late," Mr. Brown called out, sitting back on the cart holding on to his fedora. "We should probably call for help." "There's no one around for miles," Rushlight said, exhausted. "Then we've got to call some attention to ourselves," Mr. Brown said, and yelled, "Hello? Anybody out there?" There was no answer, but suddenly a strong wind blew up, taking Mr. Brown's hat along in the process and leaving it somewhere up in the branches. The chubby mouse wistfully watched his headpiece disappear. "My apologies," the wind said from some distance away. Then it turned and approached the mice in a wide curve. As it got closer, it took on the shape of an elderly wizard. An elderly wizard floating along with a beaver on his shoulder and a squirrel at his side. At this sight, Mr. Brown put his paw to the spot where his hat had just been. The wizard looked up and hovered straight to the treetops, slowly spinning. He collected Mr. Brown's fedora from between the branches and then descended slowly to the ground. "Here you are," the wizard said, handing Mr. Brown his hat. "Much appreciated," Mr. Brown replied. "Are you going to the exhibition?" he asked, pointing at the wizard's case. One corner of the envelope was poking out, enough to give Mr. Brown a clue as to where they were heading. "Indeed we are. You, however, seem to be suffering some difficulties and are now worried you may be late, I assume," the wizard said, pointing to the cart stuck in the muddy forest earth. Stuck deep enough to tell the wizard Mr. Brown and Rushlight needed help. Unlike Mr. Brown, the wizard usually needed more than just one clue to solve problems the classical way, in other words, without magic. In this case, though, he was right first time. "Your assumption is correct," Mr. Brown answered. "Well, you're welcome to travel with us," the wizard offered. "We still have some room." He lifted Mr. Brown onto his right shoulder and helped Rushlight to climb up the wooden case. The brawny mouse greeted Edward with a firm handshake. "Name's Rushlight," he said. "Good day," replied Edward. The wizard accelerated again, and, together with the post office beaver, Edward, Mr. Brown, and Rushlight, he floated on to Marigold Meadows. There are so many animals in Mousewood that a mighty wizard wanting to attend an exhibition has to expect to give some of them a lift. A great many animals had already gathered at Marigold Meadows, excitedly waiting for the Art Society exhibition. On the grass stood dozens of easels, still covered in white linen to make the grand opening even more exciting. Dressed in an elegant black suit, Mr. Ludwig Mole nervously checked his pocket watch. Only a few more minutes until he was supposed to hold the opening speech. It was only a few lines long, but he had practiced it several times nonetheless. With a speech only a couple of lines long, it would be especially embarrassing to fluff or forget something. Ludwig looked around, somewhat disoriented. "Nicholas?" he asked, tapping the shoulder of a guest next to him. This was in fact Plato the Frog, who at least resembled Nicholas in terms of colour. To Ludwig, Plato, however, was an amorphous shade, while Nicholas was more of a blurred, slender line. "Yes?" said Plato. The frog was just talking to Jonas the otter about a song he'd heard recently. "Oh, you're not Nicholas, no," Ludwig concluded in confusion. "He's right over there," Jonas said. "Nicholas!" he shouted, beckoning to his fellow musician. The lizard walked over. Jonas pointed to the mole and then continued his conversation with Plato. "Showtime, I think?" Nicholas asked his friend Ludwig. "Ah, there you are. Yes, we're about to start," Ludwig replied, calmly, now that his good friend was there. "Break a leg," Nicholas said, slapping the mole on the back. Ludwig took a deep breath and started walking through the audience. On the way, he accidentally bumped into one of the wood dwarves, who was talking to Peter the badger and his wife. "Oi, watch it," said Logger the wood dwarf. "I'm sure it was an accident," said the badger lady, trying to calm him down. "Accident? Pah!" commented Steinberg. Ludwig was far too busy to notice what was going on around him. He eventually reached the podium and took off his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. Then he gave the audience time to quieten down and prepare for the speech. Soon the animals and a wood sprite fell silent in anticipation. Ludwig's wife was in the front row, quietly applauding to reassure her husband. "Dear guests, it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you tonight here at Marigold Meadows," Ludwig began, but was immediately interrupted by the muffled boom of approaching thunder. The guests turned in the direction the sound was coming from. In a cloud of dust and leaves, the wizard appeared from the forest, coming to an abrupt landing right in front of the astonished visitors. As the dust settled, he set down the beaver, Mr. Brown, Rushlight, and Edward the squirrel. At once Edward ran to his friends Oswald and Edgar, who had arrived half an hour before. The others joined the animals in the audience, and, as the excitement wore off, Ludwig continued. "The Mousewood Art Society proudly and for the first time presents the work of an artist, a resident of Mousewood like all of us here. His paintings, completed over recent years, depict the forest from various points of view, and, of course, the perspective of the artist himself. Ladies and gentlemen, I declare the exhibition open."